So I mentioned we've given a preliminary definition of phrases. Now we're going to try a preliminary definition of clauses. All right, Mickey. See you in a bit. Yeah, we heard that was great. Don't apologize. I started late because I had a power failure here. Didn't get my power back until about, oh, half an hour after I was supposed to start. Yeah, great for Jivan, especially given that it's his birthday. So, clause is another one of these terms that I'm sure you have heard thrown around. Right? What is a clause? So, initially, we're going to say, pretty simply, that it's a constituent consisting of a subject and a predicate, which begs the question, well, it doesn't really beg the question, that's a misuse of the term, which invites the question, what are subjects and predicates? Right? Let's start with an example, which I pulled from a simplified version of the first sentence from last week's homework. My grandfather killed 2 Germans before he was 18. Right, so my grandfather is a subject, predicate, everything else, right? Killed 2 Germans before he was 18. Subject and predicate are both grammatical functions, right? You probably have some intuitive sense of what a subject might be. What they tell you in early school training is largely some version of the yeah. I mean, so a constituent, as we're using it, is a generic term for any unit of language that functions as a single whole. So a phrase is one kind of constituent. A clause, which we're just starting to talk about, is another kind of constituent. Hey, Corey, how you doing? Good to see you. I imagine we're going to see more people drifting in from Jivan's stream now that he's done, but welcome on in, early or late. Good to have you here. Does that make sense, Emmy, in terms of constituency? What the heck just happened? I did not touch the keyboard for that. All right. So, subject. What's a subject? Subjects are one of those things, just like with nouns or verbs. Yeah, the ghost in the machine. Something like that. I don't see a cat anywhere nearby. Remember with nouns, we started off by looking at nouns in the sort of traditional definition of saying that a noun is a person, place, or thing. And then I showed you why that's oversimplified. And when you look at the larger set of nouns, you have to look at other things, right? But as an entry point to saying what's a noun, especially when you're going between languages or just introducing it, for the first time, that gives you a sense of what the core central members, the typical nouns, are like. So we're going to start the same way with subjects. We're going to have to build up some knowledge base before we can be more precise, right? So for now, we'll say that the typical subject, right, refers to a person or thing that instigates an action expressed by a verb, right? It's typically a noun phrase. It usually appears at the very start of a clause, at least for what we call declarative clauses, clauses that make a statement, rather. And then in questions, it flips position with a verb, and we'll look at that again in more detail later. So these are the kinds of things, these are the features that we can use to say this thing is a subject. In baby grammar, people often talk about so-called simple subjects. And a lot of people confuse that with subject in general, right? Subjects often are not just one word. I mean, notice these examples. Okay, so George seems quite relieved. So George, there's a subject. The senator from Texas opposed the nomination. In this case, the senator from Texas is the subject. Now, when people talk about the so-called simple subject, what they essentially mean there is what in our formal term of, description of phrases that we just talked about is the head noun of the subject, right? So in the case of the second example here, senator is the head noun, and therefore also the simple subject in this case. But if I say just subject without qualifying it in any way, I mean the complete subject. So if I ask you what is the subject of the second example here, your answer to me should not be senator, just the one word, but the senator from Texas. Right? That's just a matter of keeping the terminology consistent. So subject is the whole thing. Now, for predicate, so we have half the clause, or part of the clause is the subject. Everything else, at least in simple cases, to the right of the subject is the predicate. We'll see some exceptions eventually, but there's always exceptions, right? We're looking at the typical case in this instance. Now, predicates always take the form of a verb phrase. So what we're looking at, therefore, in a predicate is the verb and all of its associated consistence. The subject is usually a noun phrase, but doesn't have to be. The predicate, though, is always going to be a verb phrase. So to go back to our original Tolstoy example, right? All happy families resemble one another. So all happy families... Oh my goodness! Gurge! Gurge, everybody has been telling me about your accomplishments. Congratulations, my friend. What a birthday present to yourself. Hello, hello, good friends. How is everyone doing? Excellent to see you all. So many Gurge hypes. Everybody who's come in, let me see. Who's in here? Crystal, Abel, Walter.
I'm afraid not, actually, Gov. We're fresh out of parrots.
Tuffy, thank you so much for that gift sub, Gurge.
Strip the fur, stick a couple
Chuck, Shiros, Zombite Kim, In a Box Kim, Cress, Walter, Gurge himself, the man of the hour, Isla. How is everyone doing? Amazing accomplishment, Gurge. Yeah. You're all late. Where's your homework? Chivon's bird ate your homework. Okay. We'll accept that. Dog ate it. Very tasty homework I assigned. We're busy on the G-Trade. Fair enough, Deja. No worries. I got started about half an hour late because my power failed. about an hour and a half before stream was supposed to start. So. Go back to Jackson. Yes. Next week's homework is going to be to bake some bread. Oh, wait, that's Breaking's homework. For those of you who don't know, Breaking is planning a Saturday stream where part of it is going to be about sourdough bread. So. No one else is admitting it. As I have said before, homework is not a requirement for this class, right? It is potentially useful, but yeah. I'm gonna bake. I'm not gonna be able to bake it on Saturday, but you know, in sympathy, I'm going to I'm gonna fire up my sourdough starter tonight. After I'm done with stream, I'm gonna step it up, and tomorrow I'm gonna make some sourdough loaves. Assuming my sourdough starter hasn't died the way Emmy's did. All right, Davey. Thanks for coming by. Appreciate it. So, for everybody who has just joined us, and in case you haven't been here before, Thursday evening is my stream that we're calling Polly Knows. And no bread for you, Walter. Oh, that's terrible. And so, you know, these are classes and basically whatever you guys want me to teach. And the Discord poll was in favor of grammar for adults. Hey, Krenzo, how's it going? Yes, kitty. I know it smells good, but no, you can't have any. Sorry. Let's see. Let me show you the chat. This is Christmas. Say hello, Christmas. Hello. She was just looking like she wanted to hop up on the desk, but I've got my dinner spread out over there, so there was no room. Well, I'm sure somebody can clip it. Sure is. You can see it. So basically we're doing grammar for adults. This is the 4th class. And we are finally getting into the sort of the meat of actual grammatical analysis. We're talking about how the different units of language are organized. And I have gone through what we mean by a phrase, and we've started to talk about clauses. Right? These are terms you might have a dim recollection of from some point in your schooling, right? And we just talked about subjects. We talked about how a clause is broken down into 2 main parts, the subject and the predicate. So the subject is something that I think a lot of people are familiar with, right? Loosely speaking, it's the topic of the verb, right? So now we're talking about predicates. What is a predicate? Christmas comes early. This is a good title, Tuffy. Thank you. So the word predicate comes from logic, actually. To predicate something is to make an assertion about it. So if I predicate, you know, and that's what the verb, if you think about it, is doing, right? If I say, well, to look at our examples here, right? If I say all happy families resemble one another. So resemble is predicating, it's making an assertion about these all happy families, right? So the verb and all of its associated elements together collectively is the predicate, right? The easiest way to think about it is for most cases, we'll get into exceptions much later, but for most cases, you've got just the subject and then everything else is the predicate. A predicate is not just one verb. Don't make that mistake, right? Subjects don't pair with verbs, subjects pair with predicates, right? Now, at the heart of every predicate is a verb. So, they're not totally unrelated to each other, right? But does anybody have any questions about subjects or predicates? Thank you for that command, Tuffy. Now, the other thing that I want to make sure we are clear about is the difference between a clause and a sentence. A lot of times when I ask ordinary, high school students, what is the definition of a sentence? A lot of times they'll tell me, oh, it's a subject and a verb, or maybe a subject and a predicate, right? But if you think about it, that's the definition I gave you for a clause, right? Now, sometimes the two are the same thing. So with the first example here, George seems quite relieved, right? So notice we got the subject, George. We got the predicate, seems quite relieved. So we got a clause. And that also is pretty clearly a complete sentence, right? It should pass our instinctive test for sentencehood, right? But look at the second example. It's apparent that George seems quite relieved. So here, the same string of words, George seems quite relieved, is part of a larger unit, right? What we have here, now George seems quite relieved is actually in a subordinate position. Right? We'll talk about subordinate clauses again in detail a later week. But I just want you to see the general idea here that this sentence has more than one clause, right? Notice even though that's mushed together, it is, you've got a subject, it, you got the verb is, and then so basically subject it, and then everything else is apparent that George seems quite relieved. That's all the predicate for the outer clause. Okay? George seems quite relieved, but his brother remains uneasy. Again, there's a different way of connecting clauses together, but you can see, I hope, that this sentence also has more than one clause in it. Right? So a sentence, minimally speaking, contains one clause, right? In the complete sense, like the kind of grammar teacher sense of what's a grammatically complete sentence, right? But another way of thinking about a sentence, which I want to point out, is simply an orthographic sense. In other words, just as an artifact of writing, you start with a capital letter, you go for a while, you end with a period, right? In one sense, that's a sentence. It might not be grammatically complete. Sometimes we use fragments as sentences. We'll say things like, because I like to, period, right? It's not grammatically complete, but in a larger context, it could definitely stand on its own, and it could be punctuated as a complete sentence, right? We haven't really talked enough about clauses and clause types for me to give you the rules for formal writing. Sentences 2 and 3 have 2 clauses each. Yes, Emmy. They're arranged in different ways, right? In the sentence 3, we have 2 clauses that are linked with a coordinator. So 2 equal units traditionally they'd be called independent clauses, right? Or main clause is another term for them, that are just equally linked with but. In the case of number 2, what we have is a subordinate clause. It's sort of inside a main clause. For the people who came in later, one of the things that I mentioned in terms of sentence structure, Christmas, don't step. I have this little cups of sauce that came with my dinner for the French fries, and Christmas almost stepped in one of them. She hopped up on the desk. But sentence structure isn't, you should think of sentence structure as like a set of Russian dolls where one unit goes inside the other, right? So in this case, George seems quite relieved as a subordinate clause. It's a lesser part inside the bigger sentence rather than being two co-equal kind of things. Now, I also wanted to talk a little bit about one very common traditional definition of a sentence, which pisses me off. Do you remember any traditional do you remember, like, on your own, a definition of a sentence? Now, I should have asked you this before I gave you the, more precise one, but do you remember what you were taught? What makes a complete sentence? A complete idea. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea that a sentence expresses a complete thought is a really common one. And that's the one I was thinking of. Okay. I don't like it either. Yeah, a sentence expresses a complete thought. Think a little bit. What do we mean? What does that really mean? What does a complete thought consist of? Consider these two examples. The founding of the college by Leland Stanford. Is that a complete sentence? It is not, right? Is the second one a complete sentence? Yeah, absolutely it is. Is there any difference in the content, like the propositional content of what's being expressed here? I'm trying to say the same thing. Exactly. So why is one complete and the other not? Does not really have much to do, if anything, to do with the semantics. It has to do with the syntax, Mickey. Exactly right. Okay. So complete thought, the way I read it, this is one of those hand-wavy things that teachers tell their students that doesn't actually mean anything, right? But what it's doing is it's appealing to the students' intuitive sense of completeness. Like when you read The Founding of the College by Leland Stanford, you probably have this feeling of like, where's the rest of it? You're waiting for something more, right? You can't necessarily articulate what you're waiting for, but you just know that something more is needed, right? So this idea of a complete thought is appealing to that intuition without actually defining anything. And of course, the problem is not everyone has that intuition. Right? Not every student is going to be able to look at this and say, oh, that's complete, or at least that's one problem. There's another even bigger problem, which is if you try to rely on this intuition, sometimes it's wrong. is this a complete sentence? It got you. Why did it get you, Mickey? Did you feel like there's something? Yeah, it implies that more words are coming. Mm-hmm. This is true. So this is not a complete thought in your 7th grade English teacher's sense of things. However, grammatically, it is absolutely a complete sentence. Is the verb. Yes, Mickey. Let me give you the next sentence. Now, if you read these two sentences together, would you think twice about whether they were complete or not? Exactly, Mickey. Exactly my point. Right? Two sentences, one idea. Okay? And there is, I mean, like, no editor in the world would say, or at least no competent editor in the world would say that these should be one sentence. Now, I'll explain a little bit, just quickly, technically, about why the first one is complete, right? The not just is setting you up for the other half, right? So you have that feeling that there's something incomplete. But grammatically speaking, if you look at what's here, right? What we have, what you could, yeah, if you wanted to, but you don't. But in fact, you change the rhythm of the sentence in a way that I think, like, you have options. You know, like, grammar gives you a lot of options. There are multiple ways to express the same idea. Now, in this particular case, I would argue that a but here would be stylistically inferior to the version that we've got here. Let me just explain what's going on in the first sentence so we're clear why it's grammatically complete. Okay, what's the subject of the first sentence? Yep, exactly right. The Last of Us Part 2 is the subject. The verb, as I already told you, is, and then everything else is and everything else. Hey, Bins, Abby's guns is the subject. How's it going, Bins? Good to see you. So, Tilu 2 is the subject. Everything else is the predicate. No, notice is what we call, I remember I gave you the term finite verb last week. In other words, it has a tense. And this is to have a complete clause that can go as a main clause independently in its own sentence. You need a subject. You need a finite verb in the predicate. We've got both of these. And there should not be any subordinator words that are going to, you know, imply that it should be part of something bigger. And so it passes all of those criteria. With not and just, if you ask yourself what parts of speech are those, what parts of speech do you think not and just are? This is a little bit tricky. Yes, Mickey, you're right. They're both adverbs. Okay. Now notice if we take, yes, adverbs is exactly right. Not is negating the verb, right? Just is qualifying the verb, not only this. So they're both adverbs. Now notice, if you take both not and just out of the sentence entirely, you would no longer have that feeling. You would flip the meaning a little bit, but you would not have the feeling that there's something more needed, right? The Last of Us Part 2 is a story about the futility of revenge, right? Add just one at a time. The Last of Us Part 2 is not a story about the futility of revenge. Again, we don't have that feeling that there's something going on. The Last of Us Part 2 is just a story about the futility of revenge. It's only when you put not and just both together that you want something more. It always gets adverb. That's exactly what you should do, Emmy, because adverb is the sort of catch-all category for everything else. Obviously there are other minor categories, but that's your best bet, frankly, for these things. One general thing to know about adverbs is they don't alter. Putting them in or taking them out doesn't change anything about the basic status of the clause. So it doesn't turn a main clause into a subordinate clause or anything like that. But different words do that. Adverbs are just sort of either there or not there. It doesn't matter. So even though they make you feel like there should be something more, grammatically, they don't make it incomplete, right? So two sentences, one so-called complete thought, and even that is like, really, is that really a complete thought? I mean, you could argue, like, if I'm writing an entire essay on something, isn't the whole essay a complete thought? Like, anyway, it's a dumb definition. We're going to be focusing on grammatical completeness, grammatical structure, not on these half-baked, hand-wavy ideas. So, you are justified, Emmy. Yes, indeed. All right. So let's talk. When we were talking about subjects and predicates, we were talking about constituency, right? Now we're going to start to get into the weeds of how you analyze it, right? How to tell what goes with what. Giving you a minute or two to take in this bit. Have any of you seen The Thin Man? Classic old movie from the 1930s. With Astor the dog, yes. Exactly. You should watch it. It's a fun old movie. I mean, so at the risk of being, as Mark Twain said, like Mark Twain was the one who said, humor is like a frog. You can dissect it, but the frog tends to die in the process. Yep, solve murders. Exactly. Maureen O'Sullivan. Yep. Hey, Fierce. So, so how does this joke work functionally? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, he's reading the paper, right? He says, "Oh, I was shot twice in the Tribune." In other words, according to the Tribune, I was shot twice. So I'm a hero, right? I read where you were shot 5 times in the tabloids, right? It's not true. You didn't come anywhere near my tabloids, right? So, obviously, yeah. Works on so many levels. Exactly, Vince. If we think about this grammatically, like what's the grammatical ambiguity? I mean, obviously, tabloids, you wouldn't necessarily think that tabloids means testicles, except for the grammatical ambiguity that he's playing off of here, right? And of course, remember, this is in the era of the Hays Codes, right? So this is about as racy as they can get, right? They have to work by innuendo and everything. But so she reads in the tabloids that he was shot 5 times, right? It's very creative. Exactly, Mickey. Yeah, I mean the one benefit of the Hays Code is simply that it forced filmmakers to get very creative, with their their things. So, she reads in the tabloids, right? So the location where she's reading, as opposed to shot in the location where he was shot, right? So in other words, what we're talking about here is an ambiguity. The tabloids were just as bad in the 1930s as they are today. It's all trash. But clearly very financially profitable trash if they've been able to survive for well over 100 years. You read them a lot. So, the scans, yeah. It's a secret pleasure. All right. So let's look at a less humorous example that will let you exercise your ambiguity detection devices. Can you see an ambiguous interpretation in this? That would be fun, Bins. You should definitely do that. By the way, tabloid or not, newspaper headlines provide. I didn't prepare any slides of them, but newspaper headlines, are perfect examples of ambiguous structure a lot of the time, right? So for example, consider this headline. Yeah, Mickey, that's precisely the 2 possible readings here. What are the 2 possible readings of the newspaper headline that I just put in chat? American. Well, I don't want to read it out, because if I read it out, it becomes less ambiguous. Whose head? Yep, you're all seeing the issue here, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, in other words, is ships a noun or a verb here, right? Either the ships from America are heading to Cuba, or an American is mailing ahead to Cuba, right? And not ambiguous, but funny. I cannot help but mention the most famous tabloid headline of all time: headless body found in topless bar. Okay. So we got 2 possibilities, right? You all basically picked up on this, right? So the first one, the Red Cross evacuated the refugees from Sudan. In other words, they were evacuated from Sudan by the Red Cross, right? The other possibility is they evacuated the refugees from Sudan, right? That's all one thing, right? So is it two separate things? And, depending on the context, this may or may not make a practical difference. But there are certainly places where it could. So consider this larger context. Right? After Hurricane Katrina struck, I'm not typing properly, struck New Orleans, Maria Veracruz, a longtime worker for the Red Cross, experienced a feeling of deja vu. When she arrived in the stricken city, she saw faces that she had encountered only 6 months before on the dusty plains of East Africa. With full appreciation of the irony, the Red Cross evacuated the refugees from Sudan for a second time. So notice here, they're not being evacuated from Sudan this time. They're being evacuated from New Orleans, but they still originally came from Sudan. So the refugees from Sudan makes sense as a single phrase. When we are analyzing structure, right, we are trying to figure out what goes with what in all of these things. And to do that, we're going to use a variety of tests, constituency tests, right? Sudanese refugees. Exactly. I mean, there are lots of ways that you can rephrase these things to make them, work in different contexts. And sometimes you'll want something like Sudanese refugees to avoid the problem altogether. Other times in context, it will be fine. Christmas, what are you doing? She's crawling through. I've got all the cables from my chaos control stuff here, and she's trying to crawl through them, which is not a good thing. Probably just hungry and wants my attention. So, right, so when we're looking at, is the refugees from Sudan, for example, Christmas controls chaos? Exactly. That would be interesting. So one good way that we can tell that something works as a unit is to use a replacement test. So notice here, let's start with this sentence. The approaching lightning forced the golfers off the course. Right? Back to golf. Notice, there should be a Christmas tree. Fortunately, she has no interest in chewing on cables, right? What she was doing there is sort of sticking her head through and sort of like moving, like she was like moving through, because I had like the cable plugged into the PS5 and the Raspberry Pi was sitting there. So she was just kind of shoving herself underneath the cable, and chaos is bound to ensue from that. But she's not a chewer. I don't, I let her go behind the computer back and sit among the rat's nest, Kevin, as I call it, of cables back there, and she never really causes any real problems. But ooh, yeah. I mean, some cats like to chew things. Christmas never has. Actually, my dog doesn't chew cables either. It's good. Always not really a chewer. Christmas will, if I leave, for ages I thought it was the dog doing this, but then I discovered it was the cat. Like if I leave a paper napkin or something out, she will grab it overnight, and I'll wake up in the morning and there will be little bits of shredded napkin all over the place on the floor. So In this particular case, yeah, I thought it was Kai doing this for ages until I actually caught Christmas red-handed doing it. She'll also like pull paper out of the trash bin and tear it up, stuff like that. But she doesn't chew on cables or anything like that. So go figure. Use dryer sheets. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Toilet paper rolls, yeah. Cats and toilet paper rolls all the time. That is definitely true. Eating that stuff, not good. So notice with these replacement tests, what I'm doing here is I'm taking one word and I am substituting it for an entire phrase, right? So the approaching lightning, we can substitute with it. It forced the golfers off the course, right? Notice that we can't substitute it for any smaller part of that phrase. We can't say the it lightning or the approaching it, right? The pronoun replaces the entire phrase. So if you can do a one-word replacement like that and covering everything, then that's a reasonable sign that it's a phrase. Same thing, notice them. Forced the golfers, forced them. Again, we're doing one-word substitution for a noun phrase. Pronouns substitute for noun phrases, right? Notice off the course, we can substitute with a one-word adverb, like away, right? Force the golfers away. So off the course, which is a preposition phrase, right, can be replaced. We can also replace the entire verb phrase, the predicate with did. The approaching lightning did, right? So this is one test we can use to tell if something is a unit or not. Right? Another thing we can do, I deliberately kept it super simple because this is a possibility. If we wanted to be a little more formal about it, we would say something like did so. Do so is a classic way of repeating the action that you've already, they didn't want to be forced off. They didn't want, forced off the course, but the approaching lightning did, or did so, right? It did force them off the course, right? That's the implied thing there. You can also apply what we call movement tests. And what we're doing here is essentially exploring how we can rearrange the parts of the sentence. Because when we rearrange things that naturally go together as a unit will get rearranged together. They will move together, right? So they found the lost puppy in the backyard. Notice we can move in the backyard as a whole to the front of the sentence. In the backyard, they found the lost puppy, right? It's a little bit less felicitous, but it would still be grammatical to put it like between found and lost. They found in the backyard the lost puppy. So you can play around with movement here. And one particular rearrangement pattern that's really useful for this kind of test is something that we call a cleft sentence. A cleft sentence is a particular pattern. There's actually a variety of clefts, but the basic one is like it was, and then something that we want to focus our attention on, and then that, and then the rest of the sentence. So notice it was the lost puppy that they found in the backyard. And I put a little underline there to show you where the thing that we're focusing would be, where it sort of moves from, if you want to think of it that way, when we rearrange the sentence. So the lost puppy is a phrase, right? That can be moved to the front. Same thing with in the backyard. It was in the backyard that they found the lost puppy. Now notice a preposition phrase like in the backyard contains its own noun phrase, the backyard. So we can move just the noun phrase, right? It was the backyard that they found the lost puppy in, right? That's perfectly fine. So So what that is showing, the fact that both of those work tells us that in the backyard is a preposition phrase, the backyard is a noun phrase, and the backyard is part of in the backyard, right? It's that Russian doll inside the other Russian doll. Okay. But notice we can't move things that aren't complete phrases, right? It was the lost that they found puppy in the backyard, right? We can't move the lost with that and leave the puppy behind, right? Because that forms one cohesive phrase, right? It was the lost puppy in that they found the backyard. So notice the lost puppy in, right? So the lost puppy is one phrase, in starts the next phrase. We can't just tack it on to the previous phrase to move it, right? Now, I put a question mark by the last one because I want to invite your opinions. Do you think this last one works grammatically or not? It does, but in what meaning? Like, is there a difference in the meaning from the way we would normally interpret the basic sentence? Yeah, Kiwi, I think that's needs to verify what else they might be looking for. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Changes what they found. Yeah. If you were meaning something along the lines of what Kiwi or Santolo are saying, Bins, then sure. But I'm not quite sure I follow you. Yeah. They found the lost puppy in the backyard. In other words, just as we saw earlier, the refugees from Sudan can be all one big phrase in the right context. The lost puppy in the backyard could theoretically be one single phrase, in which case this could move together, right? But it does slightly change the meaning because the default situation is, yeah, no worries, Vince. The default situation, I'm sure what we all think of first with this original sentence is the fact that the backyard was the location where the lost puppy was found, right? Now, since finding the subject is a really crucial thing, part of analysis, I thought I would mention specifically some tests for identifying what's the subject, right? And we can also use this as a chance for you to do your own little inference and generalization about a property of English language. So I've given you here a set of pairs illustrating a particular consistent pattern. Take a few minutes. I'm going to go make myself another cocktail. This is one of those nights where I need it. And while I do that, take a few minutes and see if you can generalize the rule here for that is being demonstrated. I've been having gin and tonic stuff. So could is not part of to be, but y'all are more or less on the right track here. Yeah, so in each of these cases, the pair that we have is a declarative versus the yes/no interrogative equivalent, right? By turn you've identified, Kiwi, exactly why I've given you this pair. So notice what's happening here, right? We have a verb. We'll talk about what the verb is in just a second, but we have a verb that in the declarative sentence comes after the subject, and in the interrogative it comes before. It's like it does a little movement, it does a little flip from one side of the subject to the other, right? And this is true. I gave you relatively short subjects here, or very short subjects in these cases, just because I didn't want to write some big, huge thing that wouldn't fit. But this always works, no matter how long the subject is. Now, the pattern here, we're going to look at verb phrases in detail next week. But the pattern here, does anybody see like what verb we move? Can you figure out the rule here? The first one. That works for almost every example. Yep. Which one doesn't it work for? Yeah, no worries, Toto. We'll talk about them next week in detail. So, was, has, could, these are all examples of what we call, yeah, Joel is the one that isn't quite consistent. So was, has, and could, these are all examples that we call auxiliary verbs, or in the lingo of the baby grammar books, helping verbs. Right? I don't know. That term always irritates me. Maybe I'm just an old curmudgeon or something. Bonkertons, Ryan, how's it going, my friend? How you doing, Bonk? Good to see you. Hello, Raiders. Thank you for the shout out, Bins. Yeah, proverb. Yeah, that's not right. You come for some learning, Bonk? We're here for you. Yeah, it's not going badly. Or at least I got a late start because I had a power failure here for a couple hours, but we're good. How was you still doing Witcher? How's Witcher 3 going? I've unfortunately been, yeah, yours went out for 15 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, mine went out like it only came back like half an hour after I had originally planned to stream, which really sucks. But yeah, moving faster than you expected. Yeah, that's interesting because I know Witcher 3 has a reputation of being one of those huge beasts of a game where you've got so much to do. We are talking about how to identify the subject, avoiding the side quests. Yeah, I've heard a lot of meme jokes about those side quests. Fetch me a pan or whatever it is. You know. Yep. I think that's up there with, I used to be an adventurer like you until I took an arrow to the knee. It's search for a secret spy note. Okay. Exactly, Mickey. I spent far too many hours playing Skyrim once upon a time. I have Witcher. I have Witcher 3 downloaded on my computer. I will get to play it eventually. Skyrim is a lot of fun. Skyrim is worth playing. That's absolutely, that's like a pretty classic. I mean, I think that's probably the definitive Bethesda game. I mean, Fallout 2, yeah, also, but I mean, Fallout series, but yeah, Skyrim's really good. Like any game of that age, it does show its, age in comparison to more modern games. But yeah, if you like the medieval stuff, it's good. And it will let it's one of those games that will let you can pick a route you want to go. You can play classic fighter, you can play magician, you can play a thief, and you can do, focus on particular skill sets and get your way through. You can finish the game in a lot of different ways, basically, which is nice. So what I was saying before Bonk so rudely interrupted us, Kappa, was that we have these so-called auxiliary verbs, right? No worries, Bonk. It's all good. And they are not verbs. They're not the sole verb there, right? Notice how we have was expecting. So expecting is also a verb, but it's preceded by another verb, right? Has been. So the been is another verb, right? Preceded by the auxiliary verb. So when you have an auxiliary verb, it's the auxiliary verb that moves in front of the subject for the question. I am very easy to distract, Santolo. It's like I'm like the dog from Up. It's like squirrel. Now, in the case of is, this verb actually behaves all unique to itself, right? Lev is determined. So notice here, determined is actually an adjective. That might look like a verb. To determine is a verb, but here it's an adjective. You can tell it's an adjective because you can stick the word very in front of it. Lev is very determined. So is here is not an auxiliary verb. It's the main verb, the only verb in the sentence, but we still move it. It has its own exceptional behavior, right? For other verbs other than is, if they're the only verb, like wanted, we don't say wanted Joel to be a musician, at least not in modern English, right? Once upon a time, older forms of English, we did do exactly that. We don't flip the whole verb. We add the auxiliary verb do, and we move that. And notice, I put for comparison, you can put the do in front of the regular verb here. It does change the meaning slightly. It makes it emphatic, right? Joel did want to be a musician, after all. If I want to stress the verb, I can add the do there. So even though it's not a perfect parallel, it does show you that the do also can come either before or after the subject. That movement there is a really good way, if you're uncertain whether something is a subject or not, try turning it into a yes-no question and see what happens to your word order, right? If you just have that one verb that's flipping position from one side of the sentence to the other, then that gives you that sort of brackets the subject for you. You know, goes on either side of it for you. Does that test make sense to everyone? All right. Give you a minute to read this. We're going to talk now about how do you show the structure of sentences in a way that's easy to apprehend. Please explain how to diagram a sentence. First, spread the sentence out on a clean, flat surface, such as an ironing board. Then, this will not be 7th grade English until I promise. Then, using a sharp pencil or X-Acto knife, locate the predicate, which indicates where the action has taken place and is usually located directly behind the gills. For example, in the sentence, Lamont never would have been a forest ranger, the action probably took place in a forest. Thus, your diagram would be shaped like a little tree with branches sticking out to indicate the locations of the various particles of speech, such as your gerunds, proverbs, adjutants, etc. I love that. It's the perfect, like, gobbledygook sort of thing of how most people regard the experience of being forced to diagram stuff. Yeah. So if you diagrammed ever, you probably did something like what I am showing on the screen here. Am I right? Yeah. So you were probably never told the name of them, but these are known as Reed-Kellogg diagrams. Reed and Kellogg were the authors of Diagram Can Be a Verb, yes. You did the sentence trees. We're going to do the sentence trees, Mickey. We're getting there. I'm glad you did the sentence trees, by the way. Did you do the sentence trees? Though I have to ask, did you do the sentence trees in college? Do I remember right that you did TOEFL or something like that? Or TESOL? Like, you studied... You did college linguistics. Yeah, so you did the tree diagrams in a TESOL course. That makes total sense. Right? But because if you did tree diagrams in like middle school, I would be both tickled pink and very surprised. You know, if you do any diagramming at all in a U.S. classroom, it's the style that I have up on the board. These are called Reed-Kellogg diagrams. They are named after the two gentlemen who wrote a series of books published in the 1870s, I think. The grammar books that introduced this method of sentence diagramming. It very quickly became popular. They were not the first ones to develop sentence diagrams, but this system really caught on in the textbook world, and it's been used ever since. They have their virtues, especially when you look at it in the context of what was known about grammar in the 19th century. They're actually, if you compare this sort of stuff to the way that English grammar was taught 50 years before it, in say the 1820s, this is a marked improvement. But there's still a lot of problems with it. First of all, our understanding about the way the structure of English works has increased a lot since Reed and Kellogg were writing, right? I mean, Reed and Kellogg were working 150 years ago. right? We've learned a lot about how English works in the meantime, that isn't reflected in this. Another flaw of this is that you have to learn what all of these different angles and lines, like what does this shape of a line mean? All of this sort of stuff. And it's not necessarily totally intuitive, right? I mean, you can kind of get what's going on here, but it's, problematic. It also is unlabeled. So notice the House of Bourbon. So if you see how this works, the basic idea is we have the core constituents on the big thick lines, and then the slanting lines show, various like modifications and stuff. So of the Henry IV of the House of Bourbon was very wise in counsel, simple in manners, and chivalric in the field, right? And that's all been broken down into these components. Notice how they're basically treating the and of Bourbon as the same kinds of things as, and this is like traditional grammar. I mentioned that it treats everything that modifies a noun as if it's an adjective, right? And that's essentially what they're doing here. Some people get these diagrams right away. In my experience, about 10 or 15% of a class sort of gets these and loves these. And another 25% or so kind of gets them and muddles through, but grumbles about it. And the rest of the people are just left scratching their heads going, what the fuck? The other really big issue with this is nobody uses these diagrams outside of middle school or maybe early high school classrooms. And in fact, I'm pretty sure they're not widely used, if at all, outside of the US. Like, as far as I'm aware, there's no tradition in Britain of using this method of diagramming. Right? This is just an American school book tradition. This is the way that linguists diagram things. This is what Mickey was alluding to. It's called a tree diagram. Now, these have their own issues and things that are complicated about reading, but one of their great virtues is that visually, it's a Christmas tree, yes. Visually, this is much, much simpler to wrap your head around than the Reed-Kellogg diagrams. Because all we're basically saying is we have a clause, and the clause breaks down into two parts, a subject and a predicate, right? Hey, Isle of Sheep, how you doing? Good to see you. Your cat woke you up. Hey, glad to have you with us. Glad to have you with us. And if you ever want to catch up, we've got the old VODs. I am putting, by the way, for those of you who might not have heard this, I am putting these VODs on YouTube. I've got the first two lessons up already. I need to do the third one. I'll do the third and the fourth probably this weekend, just to keep a permanent record of them. I know a few people were asking me for that. So, your cat woke you up. My cat doesn't wake me up by vomiting. My cat wakes me up by chewing on me by way of saying, get up and feed me, damn it, or I'll eat you. Hi, Krenzo's mom. You learned all the grammar in school, but forgot so much. Hey, no problem. If you learned English grammar in school, you have a better chance actually of having a more accurate account of the way English works than a lot of native English speakers do. Because the books that they use to teach foreign language learners English tend to actually to be more accurate, more up to date in their account of grammar than the school books that native English speakers get. I mean, we were just talking about with hairballs. Just because you're used to, yeah, you prefer what you're used to. That's a fair thing, Kiwi. Well, I hope you get to appreciate the virtues of tree diagrams. I'll explain some of the virtues. Hi, everyone's. Visually, this is a very simple breakdown, right? It's starting with a unit and just drawing lines to show you how things are related, right? So a clause, as I said, we have a subject and a predicate. Then the predicate breaks down to a verb, to what's called the subject complement, and to a preposition phrase, right? Now, this diagram that I'm showing is definitely simplified because I don't want to worry you with details that we haven't gotten to yet. Right? Mickey, you probably had to draw much more complicated diagrams like this. The other thing that this does that Reed-Kellogg diagrams don't do is it labels things, right? With Reed-Kellogg, you have to figure out what the function of something is by its position in the diagram and the way that the lines work. So to go back to the diagram. So notice here, we can tell that Henry IV is the subject because it comes to the left side of this big line. You know, it's on the big heavy line. So that's where you diagram the subject. But notice there's no label telling us that. You just have to know that, right? Was, you know, like, okay, so there's the division between the subject and the verb, right? So, you know, so there's the start of the predicate, and then that left slanting line tells us that what comes after is what's called the subject complement, right? But again, none of that is, you know, like, that's a lot to expect you to remember, right? With the tree diagram, we just label these things directly, right? So Mozart is a noun. It's a one-word noun subject. So noun phrase, subject. Remains is a verb. Beloved is an adjective, right? And so on. And then so by contemporary audience. So notice, you see, for this preposition phrase, you can see it contains a noun phrase. That makes a preposition phrase, and that goes inside the verb phrase, right? Does all of this sort of make intuitive sense as to how this is structured? You don't really need a lot of long explanation for the basics of tree diagrams, right? What you need explanations for is all the details within it, right? Like what is the object of the preposition? What is, subject complement, all of those kinds of things. Yeah, that's the goal, is just to be something that is simple, that's quick to take in, and you go. And this is what linguists routinely use to describe this, right? They are pretty much, they're not the only thing that linguists use. There are alternative diagramming schemes out there, but they're by far the most common. Most people do find trees more intuitive than Reed-Kellogg. They show it without a lot of background baggage. The labels take you a long way. You don't have to memorize strange shapes or anything like that. The one downside to tree diagrams is they do take up a lot of space. And so for very long diagrams, Unicourse's sheep is exactly where you're going to encounter tree diagrams mostly. They're not usually used, at least certainly not in America, they're not used at a pre-collegiate level. Okay, so a little bit more about tree diagrams. Typically, we draw them above the words. I mean, you don't have to do them this way. Occasionally, you'll see them drawn underneath the words, but it's just conventional to go above the words. A little bit of terminology. We talk about these things as being nodes and edges. The node is the thing that has the letters in it, right? That's the center thing. The edges are the lines that draw out from the nodes, right? We label our nodes at the bare minimum with the form, right? Remember I talked about form and function early on. So NP for noun phrase, that's the form of this, the officials from Madagascar, right? I haven't introduced the concept, this label yet. I just put it in here because I was clipping a diagram I already had ready. Don't worry about it. But you can see how the units combine. So preposition phrase. Now, the convention that we're going to be using is if we want to indicate the function of something, we will indicate the function by separating the form, from the form with a colon. So, for example, here we have the preposition phrase. From is obviously the preposition. The object of the preposition, which I've abbreviated OBJP, right, is the function of Madagascar. So noun phrase, colon, function, right? That's the basic principle that we're going to be using. That particular labeling of form and function isn't it's not universal. It's not something that you're going to see in every tree diagram, but because we're going to be talking a lot about form and function, I'm going to put in those extra labels. We use basically, tree diagrams are not unique to linguistics. All of these terms that are used, you find them anywhere that uses tree diagrams, right? Including like genealogy or math or whatever. Anything that uses this sort of directed diagram. The words themselves, right? Or well, really and then the part of speech labels are the leaves of this tree. In other words, they're the final node, the terminal branch that doesn't split any further. That's sort of the end of the path, right? So we start by doing this. And when you're constructing a diagram, typically the thing that you do is you work from the bottom up. So you start by labeling all the parts of speech the same way we did in the exercise for last week. And then you connect them into larger and larger units till you get the whole thing analyzed. Okay. So, I'm going to have you do some of these diagrams on your own, at least if you do some of the homework, right? I'll put because of the power failure I had today, I don't quite have the homework ready to post, but I'll have it by, if not tonight, by first thing tomorrow morning, so that you can take a look. And I'll, as usual, I'll send you the link in the Discord. So in terms of phrase diagrams, I thought I'd show you some very simple things. It's to show you how it works in practice and point out a couple of pitfalls that you might see. So the first thing, remember, you can have a one-word phrase. That's not a contradiction in terms, based on the way we have defined phrases. So furniture can be a one-word phrase, right? I need furniture. Right? So we draw that out. If we start with the part of speech label, but then because it's a one-word phrase, there's just a non-branching phrase. Same thing. I need sleep, or no, that's a noun. Like, sleep, my child. Right there, that sleep is just a one-word verb phrase, right? Happy, one word adjective phrase. Rapidly, one word adverb phrase, right? You get the idea. A lot of times, of course, phrases do have more than one words, right? One of the things that you're going to see a lot is binary branching, where the phrase breaks down into two parts. And so again, this is going to be a really common pattern that you're going to see over and over again. The article, very content, too rapidly, right? So each of those words forms a particular phrase. There's a lot of debates in linguistics, sort of when you're talking about syntactic theory, about how these kinds of trees should be structured. We're not going to get into any of those. We are working for those of you who might have been exposed to some of these things. I'm going to be giving a simplified analysis of things, right? What I want to do is take the simplest approach that explains the most without burdening you with too much theoretical detail. You know, there's a lot of questions that come up when you're dealing with these fine points about, is it better to do it one way or the other? We're going to go for a relatively flat thing. We're not going to assume a lot of extra intermediate things. So if you've had to deal in a college class with some of these tree diagrams, depending on your instructor, you might have had to do some really intricate stuff involved. We're not going to go there. Not because that's not necessarily justified in some way, but we won't really need it. And so we're not going to use it. Now, one thing I do want to point out, you know, like we were looking at some where it's like one word phrase and some where it's two word phrase, right? So with something like these examples, notice I've added an extra level, right? Here, I'm not showing the preposition phrase as just being a preposition and a noun together. What I'm saying is the noun forms a one-word noun phrase, and the preposition combines with the noun phrase to form a preposition phrase. So the question comes, why am I saying that? Why am I not just saying, oh, that's just a preposition and a noun, and just slap them together? The reason we're not saying it is because there is strong evidence that the preposition doesn't combine with just a noun, that it combines with a noun phrase. And we can see that, like dinner is a noun that can work on its own as a noun phrase, right? But there are plenty of nouns that can't. So consider, since Christmas has been making herself known this stream, consider something like cat, right? Cat is a perfectly good noun, but it's not a good noun phrase, right? Would you say after cat? Like I chased after cat? You wouldn't, would you? You'd say I chased after the cat, right? Or a cat, or cats, right? In other words, that position, that slot, you think of it as after and then a slot, right? The thing, yes, chased after the cat, exactly. I mean, so in other words, that slot that appears after the word after is not filled by just a bare noun on its own. It's filled by a noun phrase. That noun phrase could consist of one word. It could consist of multiple words, right? I chased after the tabby cat. I chased after the, young, declawed cat, or whatever, you want to stick in there, right? But there's a phrase there, right? Object of the preposition. Similarly, find peace, that direct object there is a phrase. That phrase might be realized by one word, or it might be realized by a lot of words, but it's still got to be a phrase. And the easiest way to think about this without getting too deep into the analysis is like prepositions are followed by objects of the prepositions. Like if there's a position that is a regular grammatical function that we give a name to, like a subject or an object, then that level, that grammatical function level, is a phrase level, not a word level. So subjects are phrases, or sometimes clauses, but subjects are not individual words, right? Same thing for predicates. Predicates are verb phrases, not individual verbs. Direct objects, indirect objects, those are noun phrases, not nouns, right? That's the basic distinction that we need to make. Okay. Now, eventually, I hope we're going to get enough detail that we can completely describe the structure from top to bottom. But there are going to be a lot of times where we either don't care about the details or we haven't yet gotten enough information to accurately describe the details. And in those cases, when we want to skip over and just say, I'm not going to analyze this. All right, Emmy, take care. Good night. Thanks for hanging out. Appreciate your company. When we want to just skip over the details, we'll use a triangle. What this is basically saying is the senator from California is a unit. It's a noun phrase that's a subject, but I'm not going to bother to show you the internal structure of how that works, right? It's the same thing for the predicate. So that's what the triangle means. It's not analyzed. Hey, Mimi, how's it going? I think everybody here is already pretty smart. Hopefully they're getting more educated, which is not the same as being smarter. You can be smart and badly educated. You can be well educated and dumb as a rock. I went to college with a few of the latter. I also want to point out a few things that I have over the years seen in people's attempts to diagram sentences. Just kind of want to point out that there are mistakes. Now, this badly educated as a rock. Well, that's easily correctable. Well, maybe not easily, but that's correctable, Mimi. You know, you can get an education. You can't fix stupid. Hey, Danny. I'm not sure if I've said hello to you this evening, but hello. In case I haven't. So this is this is a common sort of thing I see, and this is exactly along the lines of what I was just talking about, right? Notice the mistake that's being made here, right? It's politicians lie. So we have a one-word subject and a one-word predicate, and they're just being labeled as noun and verb. But that's not really what's happening, right? The subject is a noun phrase. It's a one-word. The lie, again, it's a one-word verb phrase. So you need to have that extra level. The easiest thing to do here, is just to remember, label everything with the parts of speech first, and then build up the higher level structures with the function and stuff above the parts of speech. Okay. Another thing, there is, hey, no worries, Santolo, I'm getting very close to wrapping it up. But thank you for hanging out. Appreciate it. Have a good night, sleep, and we'll see you soon. The so this is another issue that I sometimes see, right? In other words, you'll notice the way that this diagram is showing things. Look at welcomed, right? Notice that we've got edges going from welcomed both to the subject and to the predicate. What I sometimes see students do is sort of they get it backwards, right? You're used to, like, what we're showing here is like the predicate splitting into two parts, right? Welcome plus the direct object there. But they're sort of reversing the process and drawing the lines, two lines from the word to two separate things. What that's essentially saying is that one word has one child node has two parents, which is true in the real world, but it's not true for this kind of tree diagram, right? There is one sort of bizarre exception, which we'll talk a little bit about in a couple of weeks, maybe. It's a little on the complicated side, but I think I need to show it to you just because otherwise it's hard to explain a lot of things you see all the time. But anyway, for the most part, for everything we're doing now at least, you should not have two lines going upward to two different places, right? They split going downward only. Now, you might have noticed the sort of staircase layout of all these diagrams I've been showing you. I just kind of wanted to point out this is purely an artifact of the software that I'm using to create these tree diagrams, that it just does it this way sort of automatically, and it's just easier and quicker to draw this way. If you're doing a hand-drawn diagram, doing it with a constant baseline, just write out the sentence in a line and then draw up above it, that's going to be the easiest way to do it. It's kind of a pain in the ass to create my diagrams that I'm showing you that way, so I just won't do it that way, but there's no need for you to try to imitate this staircase diagram that I have on the left here. Do it the way that I'm showing you on the right. Just you write out the sentence, above it you write out the parts of speech, and then you draw in the trees going upwards. Okay. So let's warm up, let's wind up the evening by having you all do a little practice diagramming. If you have some paper available, this would be a good time to grab it, grab a pencil or pen, and let's try doing something. So here's an example sentence. Or not a sentence. Example phrase. We're going to try diagramming this phrase. So the very first thing you want to do...
Hello, foliage!
Hey, thank you for that follow. Wait. I heard the hello Polly, but I'm not seeing... Marky Dev, thank you so much for that follow. Appreciate it. And I gave away, because I was turning away, I accidentally hit the button and showed you the parts of speech. But anyway, this is what you should be seeing. This is the first stage of what you should do, right? So the is a determinative, requirements is a noun, for is a preposition, high school is a noun. Now remember, we talked about this. High school, even though it's spelled as two words, is only one word, right? We had that little test, like, it's not a very high school, right? It's a high school. So the stress shift, the very doesn't work. It's not a very high school, right? Requirements is a noun, that's right. Notice, Mimi, to require without the ments ending, require is a verb. I require something. But once we add the ment ending, that turns a noun into a verb. The requirements, the fact that you can use it after the, is a really good indicator that we are in noun territory, right? And notice also, you can't make it past tense. Yeah, Mimi. So we did lexical categories, parts of speech last week. And one of the things that I pointed out about the traditional definitions of parts of speech is that when they're based on meanings like that, they're not very helpful, especially not for things like requirements. So the core nouns, the most nouny nouns of all, are indeed things you can interact with. They're people, places, and things, right? But ideas can be nouns too, even though you can't interact with them. Yeah. Yeah. So for those of you who weren't here last week and are, yes, standards can be standard. Standard is always a noun. No, a standard can be an adjective, but when you make it plural, standards, right, that's going to be a noun. So for example, so standard could be an adjective. Like, that is the standard protocol. Their standard is an adjective. But if I talk about one standard, two standards, now I'm in noun territory. And the way I can tell I'm in noun territory is that I'm counting it, right? One of the features of nouns is that they can be singular or plural, or at least one major type of nouns is that we call count nouns is singular or plural, right? So, and in general, it's much more reliable to use these kinds of tests about the forms that the words can take. Like, can you make it singular or plural? Does it appear in front of the? These kinds of things are much more reliable indicators of whether something is a noun or adjective or verb or whatever than are these vague notional definitions like person, place, or thing, or the idea that a verb expresses an action. These kinds of things, they work for the easy cases, but they don't work for the hard cases, right? And since we're doing grammar for adults, I want to give you a system that works across the board, right? Where you don't have to do any special pleading or hand waving for it. Right? So yeah, if this, if the whole part of speech thing interests you, I do urge you to check out last week's VOD. I go into that at great length for it. Are there any other questions on how I've labeled this before we look at the diagram itself? Okay, so before I actually show you my diagram, we'll sort of talk you through what you should be thinking here based on what we've already seen. Right? Remember, build from the bottom up. And another handy tip when you're doing this on paper, work from the right to the left. That would just make sure that you have enough space for everything. So if we start at the right, we got for high school. So you notice we got a preposition followed by a noun. Now remember, the object of a preposition is a noun phrase, right? So high school, even though it's a noun, is also a one-word noun phrase. And that's going to be the object of the preposition. And then for high school is going to be a preposition phrase. And then that's going to combine with requirements and the to make a noun phrase. So this is what we get. Now, this is a simplified diagram. And when we cover noun phrases in detail in 2 weeks, I'm going to refine this diagram. So this is not our end point of a diagram. This is just to sort of show you what we're doing now, right? So what we're saying here is that the noun phrase has three basic parts: the determinative the noun requirements, which is the head of the whole phrase, and then this preposition phrase for high school that comes after the noun. Does this all make sense? Anyone have any questions about what I'm doing? Sense-ish. Okay. Yeah, practice will definitely help with this. And I do have a little exercise. It is not a complete sentence. This is just a phrase. So as a sentence, Mimi, you're right. This is absolutely incomplete. All we have here is a noun phrase. There's no verb in it, right? I'm not having you diagram the complete sentence yet because there's a lot that I haven't talked about, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put in Discord probably in an hour or two. I might get tired and go to sleep. I don't know, before I get it ready. I'll put a link to some homework. It will basically be a short list of phrases about this long for you to practice diagramming. I will also put the notes, I'll put the PowerPoint slides for tonight. As usual, I'll put them on Google Docs and give you all a link there. And we'll do the same thing. Next week we'll come back and we'll go over the homework. But my plan is, we'll see how far I get. My plan is next week we will talk about the detailed structure of verb phrases. And then the week after that, we'll talk about the detailed structure of noun phrases. And once we have those two down, we can move through adjectives and adverbs pretty quickly, and we can get on to clause structure. Once we do clauses and subordinate clauses and stuff like that, once we get sort of to that point, we're going to be spending some time doing all these details, because once we get to understand how clauses are put together, then we can start to really think about how we can how we can use the different clause types and sentence patterns available to shape the meaning of sentences in a rhetorical way, right? I promised you that we would think about how to use grammar to help your writing and general expression, to think about the connection between these structures and the different ways we have of expressing ourselves, right? And I have not lost sight of that. I just sort of wanted to remind you of that, because before we get there, we're going to spend a few weeks in the weeds, and it'll get a little complicated at places, right?